Hockey's Origin Unmasked. Chapter 1. Invention or Misdirection. Montreal, 1875. Some say that no one ever leaves Montreal, for that city, like Canada itself, is designed to preserve the past, a past that happened somewhere else. Leonard Cohen. Montreal between 1850 and 1880 is presented as the most innovative hotbed of sports in history. In just 20 years, this city invents lacrosse, hockey, American football, and if James Naismith had continued teaching at McGill University one more year, perhaps basketball. What is the coincidence that 4 of the 5 major North American sports were all founded in Montreal in a 30-year period? And we know nothing about how baseball was really formed, so who knows? Montreal might be able to claim that sport also. How is that possible? The obvious answer is that it wasn't. Nothing was invented in Montreal. That story is a big misdirection. So what happened in Montreal, specifically regarding the supposed first game of organized hockey in 1875? It becomes obvious, with even just a little investigation, that this is not the first hockey game played on ice, as many ice games are documented long before 1875 in England and Canada, as the excellent book On the Origin of Hockey by Gideon, Huda, and Martel shows. The 1875 game appears to be some sort of marker. One question to ask is, what is that marker, and who is doing the marking? Most hockey historians will claim that the inventor of modern hockey is James George Alwyn Creighton, who organized the first recorded Canadian game in 1875. Amazingly, he is not in the Hockey Hall of Fame. Let that sink in. The supposed inventor of the sport is not in its Hall of Fame. I find this omission to be very strange. Creighton was born in 1850 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. His father was part of the shipping and wholesale food business. He received an HBA from King's College in 1868, later associating with Dalhousie University. Soon after, he became a survey worker for Sanford Fleming, the engineer-in-chief for the Intercontinental Railway, and known today as the inventor of everything. We will come back to Fleming's connection later. I think he is also very important to this story. Back to Creighton. He moved to Montreal in 1872 and became an engineer on such projects as the Lachine Canal and the Montreal Harbour. During his time in Montreal, he became a member of several clubs, including the Victoria Skating Club. Beyond being a hockey pioneer, he later went to work for the Senate in Ottawa, and also, amazingly, became a part of the Rideau Hall Rebels, with the sons of the Governor-General, Lord Stanley of Preston. This is the person who would create the Stanley Cup. Creighton's connection to the Stanley Cup tends to be overlooked. We will get to that also. The claim is that he began to organize early morning games with his friends from McGill University as early as 1873, perhaps bribing the caretaker to have access to the rink on Sundays. There is no direct evidence for this, only claims of the last surviving player, Henry Joseph, in the 1930s. We do know that Creighton was a team captain in the 1875 game, and also for a few games in the subsequent years. He himself never had anything to say about his involvement in these games. Part of the historical claim is that he took the ball and stick games of his youth from the ponds of Nova Scotia to Montreal. Generally, this gets presented as meaning the games of the British colonials. The local Nova Scotia Micmac natives and their ice games have been presented as having a connection to the origin of hockey, but few have really seen just how much that may be. Recall that for several decades, the Micmac were the only ones in Canada that seemed to be able to make proper hockey sticks. They were likely using a flat wooden disc for their ice games for at least a century, and had been using bone skates long before the new iron and steel models began to appear in the 1800s. The Indigenous peoples' connection will demand an entire chapter to properly assess their part in the real origin story of hockey. Suffice to say, there is no proof of exactly what ice games Creighton played as a kid, or what rules he did or did not use for those games. So again, why Montreal, 1875, and James Creighton? And why for several years do only the sons of British elite play in hockey games? The announcement for a new game to be played at the Victoria Skating Rink was made in the March 3rd Montreal Gazette newspaper that was likely in fact written by Creighton himself, in the future becoming a writer for both the Gazette and several book companies. Victoria Rink. A game of hockey will be played at the Victoria Skating Rink this evening between two nines chosen from among the members. Good fun may be expected, as some of the players are reputed to be exceedingly expert at the game. Some fears have been expressed on the part of the intending spectators that accidents were likely to occur through the ball flying about in too lively a manner, to the imminent danger of onlookers. But we understand that the game will be played with a flat circular piece of wood, thus preventing all danger of its leaving the surface of the ice. Subscribers will be admitted on the presentation of their tickets. Both sides in the game had 9 skaters, though no one can say why this number was chosen. If we look at the games that were played on ponds and lakes, open ice shinny or hurley could have as many as 50 players per side, so needed to be reduced given the confined space of the Victoria Rink. But why 9 and not 7 or 15? 15 would have made sense if this was supposed to be winter rugby practice, as much of the legend suspects. This announcement gives us a few pieces of information. The first is that it is using the term hockey, and not giving any explanation what the name means. Secondly, it says that some of the players are reputed to be exceedingly expert, though it seems that no one has ever seen them play. It would also indicate that even seeing them, no one would be able to rate their ability anyway. The paper is thus suggesting that anyone viewing this ice game would have no idea what was going on. It also indicates that a flat piece of wood, the word puck not used in Canadian print until 1876, would be used, as a way to avoid injuring spectators. The article is all about promotion, trying to draw a crowd. Thus, the flat disc is all about spectator safety, not its importance over a ball in the ice game being played. If this match was really about showcasing a new sport, as some have tended to present, then Creighton would have selected 14 or 15 players from Nova Scotia, where the game was supposed to originate, and bring them to Montreal to show off their top skills. What we have here instead are a bunch of Montreal elite who are young, athletic, and soon to be rich, showcasing a sport that they probably had little life connection with. I don't really think this was some idea Creighton had to showcase a sport from his youth. This was more of a plan much higher up the ladder. Creighton was likely just the chosen frontman to make it happen. The game was played at the Victoria Skating Rink, seen in illustration 1, which had an ice surface of 204 feet by 80 feet. All arenas since 1875 have pretty much mirrored the definitions of the Victoria Rink, as if without even knowing it, enshrining the Victoria Arena as the original temple of hockey. And I don't mean that lightly. I get the sense that the Victoria Skating Rink was held in some sort of religious esteem prior to this exhibition game, and somehow elevated itself in the years that followed. Recall that in the near future, this arena would be the site of Lord Stanley's first view of hockey during the Winter Carnival of 1889, the first Stanley Cup playoff game in 1894, and was where the first telegraph wires would be set up to move play-by-play back to Winnipeg, marking a new step in the sport and technology in Canada. It had been solely built as a skating facility for the wealthy, and was known for its many fancy dress-type ball functions. Its location at 49 Drummond Street, now 1187, put the arena into the area of Montreal known as the Golden Square Mile, where Montreal's rich British businessmen lived. Other rinks for the lower classes would be built in other locations around the city. The arena originally had 500 gas lights to shine at night, while a band performed for the skaters, but later it became the first building with electricity in Canada. It was sold in 1925 after the building of the Forum, the new temple of hockey, and the Victoria site was turned into a parking garage. The next day, March 4, came the first hockey game report, again in the Gazette, and again likely written by Creighton. Hockey. At the rink tonight, a very large audience gathered to witness a novel contest on the ice. The game of hockey, though much in vogue on the ice in New England and other parts of the United States, is not much known here, and in consequence, the game of last evening was looked forward to with great interest. Hockey is played usually with a ball, but last night, in order that no accident should happen, a flat block of wood was used, so that it should slide along the ice without rising, and thus going among the spectators to their discomfort. The game is like lacrosse in one sense, the block having to go through flags placed about 8 feet apart in the same manner as the rubber ball, but in the main, the old country game of shinty gives the best idea of hockey. The players last night were 18 in number, 9 on each sides, and were as follows: Messrs. Torrance, captain; Meagher, Potter, Joff, Barnston, Gardner, Griffin, Jarvis, and Whiting; Creighton, captain; Campbell, Isdale, Joseph, Henshaw, Chapman, Powell, and Clouston. The match was an interesting and well-contested affair, the efforts of the players exciting much merriment as they wheeled and dodged each other, and notwithstanding the brilliant play of Captain Torrance's team, Captain Creighton's men carried the day, winning 2 games to the single of the Torrance 9. The game was concluded about 9:30, and the spectators then adjourned, well satisfied with the evening's entertainment. The SIHR Web Archive has managed to find the first names of these players, as well as provide biographies of them. Charles E. Torrance, captain; Daniel Meagher; Thomas J. Potter; Edwin H. Goff; William M. S. Barnston; George W. Gardner; W. O. Griffin; Francis Jarvis, and a fellow named Whiting. The other team was composed of James G. A. Creighton, Robert Isdale, Henry Joseph, Frederick C. Henshaw, William B. Chapman, Robert W. H. Powell, and Edward S. Clouston, along with the brothers Stuart Campbell and George Campbell. We will get back to these names in a moment. The March 4 article says there was a very large audience, while other sources, such as Michael McKinley, have suggested the actual number present was 40. Nowhere have I seen a variable number for the spectators present. The article says that the sport is very much in vogue on the ice in New England and other parts of the U.S. Does the newspaper mean that literally? That an ice sport called hockey was not just being played but was popular in the eastern United States? Most historians try to present that this reference in the article meant various games on the ice such as shinny, bandy, or ice polo. But given that Creighton was likely the writer of this article, or at least for what we can for sure call the source, this should be taken as a direct pointer. The question no one was asking was, with which group was the sport popular with, and what happened to all this hockey in the Northeast USA? Granted, several articles and books through the 1880s described an American stick and ball ice version known as ice polo that held great popularity, which was different from Canadian hockey in the sense of having a bigger outdoor surface, heavier sticks, a ball, and no offside rules would come in Canada. As for this game in Montreal, the newspaper report tells us very little about the rules. The article compared the game to lacrosse, already popular in Montreal, but claimed that the block must go through flags. I would assume meaning poles frozen in the ice with flags on top. Why one needs flags is not really explained. The article compared the game more to shinty, the Scottish game. What is interesting that this is not compared to hurley, the Irish game, which is supposed to be what early ice games in Canada were known as. A big part of this 1875 game was about presentation, and presentation of and for the Scottish-British contingent in Montreal. There are only English-Scottish-sounding last names among the players. This would be the norm for most of the next 15 years. Right from the beginning, the game's official source, the Montreal Gazette, is all about creating an image. We will see that other papers, not focused on this image making, had a completely different report about this first game. Also, there's no mention of hitting in this game, or any kind of contact at all, just that the players wheeled and dodged. If there had been any hitting, I am sure the article would have mentioned this and would have been a unique feature. A depiction of this game in the documentary Hockey: A People's History Episode 1 showed a number of players being hit and smashed. But there is no such evidence that hitting of any kind took place. That is not to say it didn't, but there is no reference in the article, and it does not seem likely once one begins to understand what this March 3 game really was. I suggest that this game should have appeared more like a group of buddies going out to shoot some hoops after work. It would have been competitive in that they would like to win their contest, but not competitive enough that they would want to injure any of their fellow participants. These are all very connected men, all in the same elite clubs, all going to the same McGill University. This is not smash-em-up hockey as so many historians have wanted to present. However, which is another part of the legend of the origin story as years went on. However, it seems someone did in fact get smashed in the first game. Let's look at an article that appeared in another paper, the Montreal Witness, on March 4, 1875. Hockey in the Victoria skating rink. Last evening, a game of hockey was played in the Victoria skating rink between two nines, and then lists the players. The game is generally played with a large rubber ball, each side trying to knock it through the bounds of the other's field. In order to spare the heads and nerves of the spectators, last evening a flat piece of board was used instead of a ball. It slid about between the players with great velocity, the result being that the Creighton team won 2-1 for the Torrents. Owing to some boys skating about during the play, an unfortunate disagreement arose. One little boy was struck across the head, and the man who did so was afterwards called to account, a regular fight taking place in which a bench was broken and other damage caused. It was the intention of the players to have another game, but the disgraceful affair put a stopper on it. So we find that there was more to this game than the Gazette mentioned. Before we get to the incident, it tells little of the game itself, just that the game is generally played with a large rubber ball. So where is it generally being played? And why does the article suggest it must be knocked through the bounds of the other's field? That is very strange language, with no mention of goals, posts, or flags like in the Gazette. This sounds very much like a field sport being compared with. If ice sports were so popular, as suggested in the standard historical narrative, then every reporter should have seen hundreds of examples of games played on ice during their life to compare with. So why be so confounded by it? To be honest, it is almost as though whoever is presenting this report in the paper has no idea what they were watching. For Canada in 1875, that strikes me as very strange. Then the Witness article described a disagreement, with boys used to having the rink for their own skating. This article claims one boy was struck across the head. Lovely gesture. Then seemingly a fight between the boy's parents and the players occurred. Another similar newspaper report has long been claimed in books to have come from the Kingston Whig Standard. I have looked through that paper for the month of March 1875 and did not find any such report. Again, the SIHR came to the rescue and found that the paper who covered the story was in fact the Times of Ottawa, who presented that a disgraceful sight took place at Montreal in the Victoria Rink over a game of hockey. Shins and heads were battered, benches smashed, and the lady spectators fled in confusion. What does seem certain here is that something did happen during the hockey game at the Victoria Rink, and there was some sort of fight between players and spectators connected to the skating club, which did cause the game to be stopped. And it sounds brutal. Shins and heads were battered, benches smashed. Why does the Gazette not make any mention of it? This is a very important question. It will make more sense when you've read the upcoming chapter on the snowshoe and lacrosse clubs of Montreal, for to realize that this game was not just a foray into starting a new winter sport. It was also a marketing tool to set up a Canadian identity and also to give the upper middle class an activity to identify themselves as Canadian. There is a lot wrapped up in this 1875 experiment. Sports were taken at the time by British as a means to learn proper adult skills. As written by Paul Kitchen, sporting competition promoted discipline, cooperation, fair play, gentlemanly conduct, resolve, respect for teammates and opponents, and overall proper behavior. Thus, anything that might shine a bad light on the players or sporting endeavors needed to be quietly ignored. This ignorance by the Gazette is one of the most important pieces to come out of this game, presenting that everything looked nice when obviously it was a chaotic mess. But again, animosity was not between the players, who likely behaved in a very fraternal fashion with each other. I looked into several of the names that appear in the listings as those who played in this first game and asked, what can we know about these people? We start with the other team's captain, Charles E. Torrance. He had fought in the Fenian raids of 1866 and 1870, as many of the other early players had as well. His grandfather, John Torrance, was director of the Bank of Montreal and was one of the wealthiest men in Montreal. including having a 42-room stone mansion that included gardens, orchards, and wineries. Like just about everyone connected with all of hockey origins, including Creighton, Charles attended and went on to study at McGill University. After graduating, he became an agent importing tea from the Far East. Later, he became president of the Victoria Skating Club. On Creighton's team, we have Frederick C. Henshaw, who was also a lieutenant colonel of the Victoria Rifles and sat on the board of directors for Montreal Street Railways, the Marconi Wireless Telegraph, and various banks. By 1888, he was vice president of the Montreal Football Club, president of the Victoria Skating Club, and honorary president of the Victoria Hockey Club. Some reports have suggested that it was he, not Creighton, who was importing sticks and pucks from Nova Scotia, due to his wife being the daughter of Nova Scotia coal mine owner John McDougall. Henshaw was also president of the St. George Snowshoe Club in the early 1880s and later held the position Council of the Argentine Republic. Another member on Creighton's team was Edward Clouston, who was the president of the Bank of Montreal, an advisor to several Canadian finance ministers, and he went on to become one of the trustees of the Allen Cup and the Minto Cup. He is also claimed to have been captain of the famous 1874 Harvard-McGill football game. His Wikipedia page is loaded with all sorts of banking and financial information, and how he was one of the first 5 Montreal residents to own a car, with no mention whatsoever about his important hockey background or being part of the first hockey game. Another of Creighton's teammates was Henry Joseph, who apparently also played in that famous 1874 McGill versus Harvard football game. What made that game famous is there are claims that the rules of the game were altered as the game continued with Joseph's assistance. Also, Joseph was claimed to be the founder of ice lacrosse in February 1875, even though there is a listing of an ice lacrosse game played at the Victoria Skating Rink in 1871. So what luck? One of the players of the first hockey game was also a rules inventor in 3 ball and stick sports within a span of 2 years. And by the way, he also happened to have competed at one of the first U.S. Open tennis championships. He was the last surviving member of the original group of players, and it was he who presented the information as to how Creighton had been the organizer of the entire first hockey game in an interview in the Montreal Gazette, either in 1936 or 1943. But there's more. Joseph also became president of the Windsor Hotel, the very hotel where the NHL was founded in 1917. He finished out his life buying many properties in British Columbia in an area known as Millionaires' Row. The rest of the players will be a brief overview. George and Stuart Campbell came from a Scottish line of wealthy landowners and also played football. William Chapman was a merchant and one of the founders of the Metropolitan Club in 1974. That played in a key hockey game in 1877 that will be later presented. Robert Isdale was a wholesale broker and one of the founders of the Montreal Corn Exchange, and also a founder of the Metropolitan Club. Robert Powell was a doctor, and not just any doctor, but the personal physician for Canadian Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald in Ottawa. William Barnston and George Garner were stockbrokers. Henry Goff was a clerk at the Bank of Montreal. W.O. Griffin was known for his lacrosse play, while Francis Jarvis and Thomas Potter were bookkeepers. The player called Whiting in the newspaper still remains unknown. This is the pedigree of the players listed as taking part in the first game. Why does this group of elite, soon-to-be rich, want to take part in a rough-and-tumble new sport of hockey? Unless, as I mentioned earlier, the game was not so rough and tumble, and was very gentlemanly and refined. Yet if this was a type of fraternal ritual, even an initiation, not for the people involved, but of a sport or an organization, it would all make more sense. There is one final name on the first hockey players list that I have not discussed, that being Torrance's teammate Daniel Meagher. Granted, there's not much to say about Daniel other than he was a medical doctor in Montreal. The connection is to his brother, George, claimed to be the magical father of hockey everywhere in Europe. George Meagher, born in Kingston in 1866, was one of the world's first figure skating champions. He went to Paris on a figure skating expedition in 1894 and was claimed to be surprised that the French were not familiar with hockey. By some freak chance, George just happened to have 12 hockey sticks with him on the trip, because, as you know, every figure skater who travels across the globe also needs to carry a dozen hockey sticks. While in Paris, he's claimed to have formed both the Paris Hockey Club and the Club de Patineurs de Paris, so each would have someone to play. The story might seem plausible if it stopped there, but alas, it continues. He then went on to London and formed a hockey league there, and then in Glasgow, Scotland, where he did hockey exhibitions. He then did the same in Nuremberg, Germany, and then in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he explained, "Hockey is going to take here, St. Petersburg, as it has in other cities. It is exciting, scientific, and an excellent exhibition game, so why shouldn't it be popular?" This magic origin story for how hockey spreads is going to turn up again and again to explain how hockey came to such places as Winnipeg and Toronto. Just by chance, someone shows up surprised. No one is playing hockey and neither has some sticks or sends for some, and there goes the sport. But in each case, these stories will be shown as a type of fabricated myth. And when you see these stories of hockey's origins are a type of legend, then one can start from scratch with everything we think we know. What are the myths attempting to hide or cover over? And why does Meagher bring hockey to Russia in 1894, where he thinks it will become incredibly popular, but then seemingly no one knows anything about the sport again until 1946, the country only playing bandy up to that point? George Meagher has far more hockey connections. He wrote 3 figure skating books, including the 1995 Lessons in Skating, which somehow had Lord Stanley, yes, that Lord Stanley, write the foreword. But there's more. His older sister, Mary, married Montreal alderman William Farrell, and their son went on not only to be a star on the Stanley Cup champion Montreal Shamrocks in 1899 and 1900, but who was also inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1965. More so, it was Art Farrell who wrote the first book about hockey in Canada in 1899. Others had come out in the U.S. previously. And as so many odd parts to it, I had to include an overview of the book in a separate chapter. Meagher also ends up with an odd obituary, as men like James Creighton will also have, and whose burial certificate describes him as an artist. The second hockey game on March 16, 1875 was reported in the Gazette, this time between 2 named teams, the Victoria Skating Club and the Montreal Football Club. The Montreal Gazette presented that the players will be in uniform this time, which will add greatly to their own comfort and ease, we should imagine, and will certainly lend to additional picturesque attraction to the game. This writing style sounds very similar to how Creighton wrote his chapters in Picturesque Canada in 1882. Creighton was presented as the captain of the football 9, and his side wore sweaters with red and black stripes, while their opponents wore white shirts. A note about all the newspaper game reports from Montreal in the 1870s, while they do include a list of all the players and the final score, there's no information about who scored, how long the game was played, either by time or number of goals, nor if penalty infractions incurred. At the same time, it has been found that in England newspapers as far back in 1870 were reporting on games of ice hockey and bandy, which often included the names of the goal scorers, and in one case, even the times of the goals. The absence of not reporting who scored in the games played in Montreal seems odd. As for the game itself, again the Montreal Gazette the day after the second game was there to give its overview. After again listing all the players, the paper claimed, Captain Creighton, whose individual play deserves special encomium, did all he could to get his men together and make them play into each other's hands, but to no purpose. They seem to have lost that organized system which distinguished their play at the beginning of the afternoon, and the result was a well-deserved victory for their opponents, who certainly did play exceedingly well and with remarkable science. This is an important article. Right away there is the discussion of team play and systems, and by not playing as a team is the reason why Creighton's team lost. More importantly is that the winning team was said to play with remarkable science. We will see that this choice of words, playing sports as a science, will be an important component for the British colonialists to present the reason why they are the inventors of a previously unskilled and unscientific native pastime. Their science and organization is what was needed before something could be called a sport. Many of the layers that will be brought out in this book about why and how hockey was invented in Montreal are already apparent in the newspaper reports of 1875. Please also recall that in another coincidence of 1875, the Field Hockey Association of England was formed and put out its first set of rules on April 10. Hockey is magically forming worldwide, on ice and on the field, and within a month of each other. Now that the basis of hockey in 1875 has been presented, we can get back to the very coincidental life of James Creighton. A direct connection is to Sanford Fleming, who hired Creighton out of university and sent him to Montreal for his works projects. Often overlooked, but presented by hockey historian Paul Kitchen, is that Fleming was an excellent skater, and at his 25th anniversary he thought there was no better way to celebrate than to have a skating party at his personal rink at his Ottawa Sandy Hill residence. Thus, the key backer of Creighton's professional life was also a skater from Nova Scotia, and likely would have had knowledge of any outdoor hockey games taking place in that province. Fleming also had a personal outdoor rink at his house in Ottawa, long before Lord Stanley's rink was being discussed. The two Nova Scotia skating enthusiasts did not stay geographically apart for long, as Creighton soon joined Fleming in Ottawa. One of Fleming's key chroniclers was George Munro Grant, who wrote a best-selling book at the time about Fleming's crossing of the Rockies. I mention Grant as he later also connects with Creighton, as Creighton will be one of the writers of Grant's historical book series Picturesque Canada in 1882. Fleming would also work together with Grant in the 1880s as Chancellor and President of Queen's University in Kingston, even though he quit school at the age of 14. Fleming became a Freemason in 1854 and was later fully knighted into the Order of St. Michael and St. George, the same order that both Creighton and Grant would also gain access to as companions but not full knights. One must ask why Creighton, whose accomplishments are nothing compared to Grant and Fleming, winds up in the same British knight class, unless it is to include his hockey origin background. However, it seems Creighton never spoke to anyone about his being the founder and organizer of hockey. His name doesn't even appear in print connected with hockey until after he's dead, that being the Henry Joseph interview that claimed Creighton was the 1875 games organizer. In another coincidence, Sanford Fleming is buried in Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa, where many of the founders of hockey, including James Creighton, are also buried. Creighton was also an early football player, and he was a key member of a meeting in Toronto in October 1875 to organize an interprovincial association. The previous year, 1874, he wrote a testimonial for spring skates for the Star Manufacturing Company of Dartmouth. By 1880, Creighton had finished his McGill Law course and joined a law firm in Montreal. On March 3, 1882, he accepted a position as a law clerk of the Senate in Ottawa, where he preferred to be known as Alwyn, his middle name. Creighton became the parliamentary counsel to the Senate in 1909 and stayed in the position until his death in 1930. His initial appointment to the Senate was on March 3, 1882. The same day, March 3, he is supposed to be the founding of hockey in 1875. That is not some freak coincidence. It's a hidden message to those that can see it. James Creighton was also an author and historian, and wrote 2 chapters in the 1882 Munro Grant book Picturesque Canada, The Country as It Was and Is. Creighton's 2 chapters were titled French-Canadian Life and Character in Volume 1 and The History of the Lower Saguenay in Volume 2. So he seemed to have claimed quite a knowledge of French-Canadian history, which he might well have had. The chapters were well written, with plenty of praise for the habitant farmer and much detailed presentation of nature and scenery. The question I have is, how exactly did a man only in Montreal for less than 10 years, with a background in law and engineering, become such an expert in the history, thoughts, and ideas of the French-Canadian farmer? Creighton also wrote the book Origins of the Northwest Mounted Police, as well as some fishing and outdoor pieces in other magazines and books of the period. However, what does get our attention is the chapter that follows his in the first picturesque volume, which is about the city of Montreal. Oddly, he did not write this chapter, but it was written by Reverend A.J. Bray and John L'Esperance. In that chapter, they described the winter sports scene of Montreal. But Montreal is more interested in outdoor sports and in organizing amusements than in art. The Victoria Skating Club, whose famous rink on Drummond Street, one of the first erected on this continent, has been the scene of many brilliant fancy dress entertainments which royalty and nobility have graced. These carnivals on the ice were first instituted here and have since become popular elsewhere. There are 3 curling clubs, the Caledonian, Montreal, and Thistle, with a Canadian branch of the Royal Caledonian Curling Club of Scotland. Snowshoeing has been reduced to an art. He then gives a long discussion about how much he enjoys snowshoeing. Lacrosse is the national game of Canada, and in that character it had its birth in Montreal. 4 or 5 years ago, a select team made the tour of England and had the honor of playing before Her Majesty at Windsor. Then he speaks of the local Indians losing their supremacy in the sport. There is also a golf club established in 1873, a bicycle club, football club, and a chess club, with numbers among its members some of the strongest and most brilliant players in the country. The chapter also discusses that there are also clubs for the protection of fish and game, one society to prevent cruelty to animals, as well as clubs for boating, bicycling, and yachting. Meanwhile, page 130 has a plate that is labeled Government House from the Skating Pond, with 3 couples together skating on the ice and 2 parents with 2 children each. So what is missing in that description? If you said hockey, you win a prize. Here is a chapter touting the greatness and innovation of Montreal, its finest chess players, great curling rinks, even saying that it was the founder of lacrosse, but the article does not once mention the new sport that was recently invented in the city. A bicycle club is mentioned, but not hockey. Creighton himself did not write the article, but he was associated with the book as an author, and he was an obvious well-known sportsman in the city. You would think the Reverend and Creighton might have met once or twice. I just find it a very odd omission when the chapter is all designed to present the specialness of Montreal and lists everything about Montreal sports with the exception of hockey. Not even a mention that games like hurley or shinny on the ice had been played by thousands of young sports-minded folks for many years. Stick and ball games on the ice seem just not to exist in the mind of the book writers. But James Creighton's hockey luck is not done yet. He becomes a founding member of a new hockey team in 1889 in Ottawa that included the sons of the Governor-General Lord Stanley. It is through this team, the Rideau Hall Rebels, that not only will hockey be barnstormed and grown across the province of Ontario, but in just 3 years the Governor-General would purchase a new Hockey Challenge trophy that would later become the Stanley Cup. Thus, Creighton was also directly involved with the person that created the Stanley Cup. But his Ottawa hockey connections raise a couple of questions. He moved to Ottawa in 1882, and the following year the Ottawa Hockey Club started, again very coincidental to Creighton's arrival. The story claimed that the team formed after 2 or 3 young men from Ottawa watched games played at the Montreal Winter Carnival. Creighton was not one of them, nor was he part of the organization on their return to Ottawa. Why was Creighton not involved with the first hockey team? He would have known about its creation. He was in the same clubs as the founding players, and the team was discussed in various city newspapers. Many of those players, as I will show in a future chapter, turned out to be transplants from McGill University to Ottawa, and as such, they should have all known Creighton personally. Why is he not involved? Something is odd with the presentation that he is nowhere to be found around the formation of hockey in Ottawa. However, when the next big thing hockey-wise is rolled out, there he is, front and center. This new 1889 parliamentary team, nicknamed the Rebels, has many oddities surrounding them, and they will be examined in Chapter 6. Also coincidentally, James Creighton was a cousin of famous Canadian folklorist Mary Helen Creighton, another, of course, McGill graduate in music. She was born in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia in 1899 and lived for 100 years. Using grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, she collected over 4,000 traditional songs, stories, and beliefs in a career that spanned several decades, and she published many books and articles on Nova Scotia folk songs and folklore. She received numerous honorary degrees for her work and was made a member of the Order of Canada in 1876. There was later criticism of her work by historian Ian McKay in his book Quest of the Folk, who claimed Helen was creating a type of Scottish commodification to connect the upper elite with the working class by appropriating older folk songs. In a sense, making people believe that Nova Scotia really is New Scotland and not a conglomerate of native peoples, French Acadians, and British colonists. It's an interesting criticism that just as well may be leveled on the elite in Montreal sports. I bring this up as a discussion point that perhaps James Creighton was less an inventor or more like an archivist like Helen. Was he bringing something back from a long-forgotten past? There's another famous Creighton historian in Canada, That would be Donald Creighton, born in 1902 in Ottawa, and might have born in 1902 in Toronto, and might have links to our story. His most famous book was published in 1937, titled The Commercial Empire of the St. Lawrence, 1760 to 1850. It was a study of the English merchant class in relation to the St. Lawrence River in Canada. Recall, this is the same area of historical subjects, the southern part of Quebec, that James Creighton also wrote about in picturesque Canada. That Donald's best-known historical work is about the British elite of Quebec in the early 1800s is also coincidental. Wikipedia claims that Donald became a criticizer of the ruling Liberal Party in the 1940s for undermining Canada's link with Great Britain and moving towards closer relations with the United States, a policy which he strongly disliked. This again seems remarkably similar to the very reasons I am claiming, in Chapter 2, that hockey would be taken by the British and used to create a unique, non-American identity for Canada. In 1944, Donald wrote Dominion of the North, A History of Canada, quite literally becoming the go-to work for the history in many schools. Donald claimed he was writing his history to combat against the so-called liberal interpretation of Canadian history that would ultimately lead to Canada being absorbed into the United States. James Creighton lived in Ottawa until his death in 1930, a member of the Skating Club and the prestigious Rideau Club. Any comments that have been written about him by fellow people who knew him were all exemplary. His funeral was attended by former Prime Minister Robert Borden. Creighton's obituary lists his recreations as exploration, salmon fishing, angling, and skating. There's no mention of hockey. The guy who formed the sport, and might have even been the one who directly created the Stanley Cup, has no mention of hockey in his obituary. Is that not strange? Some have suggested that he lived life as a very modest man who didn't want the fame and publicity. Maybe, but there might also be something more going on with this story. His Beechwood Cemetery grave had been unmarked until the Society for International Hockey Research had it marked in 2009. The explanation for a lack of a monument had been because he and his wife Eleanor had no children. Maybe. I've been to many cemeteries in my life and have seen many grave sites marked for people who died without children. He worked as a high official for the Canadian Parliament, had a former Prime Minister at his funeral, was close friends with at least one Governor-General, was a member of the most elite clubs in Ottawa, a city where he had been an excellent community member for 48 years, and buried in the elite cemetery, not just of the city, but the entire country, and no one marked his grave? Trust me, something is very odd about this, as will be the case for another hockey founder, James Stewart of the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association, who will also later be buried in an unmarked grave in Seattle. I hope you will start to see that James Creighton was not just some Halifax shinny player who wanted to keep the McGill rugby team fit in the off-season as long been presented. I think that is what many in the early years wanted people to believe. We saw that not only was he a writer, but likely the very one doing the writing in the newspapers for the early games. He could have thus been organizer, player, and promoter all in one package. I will show that he may have also been a cog in a much larger system, started in the early 1840s, after the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. The cog being to tie native Aboriginal and French Canadian culture together, and then British them up by adding organization and structure in order to create something seemingly new, an invention. It is my suspicion that he was just a front man for a much bigger story going on behind the scenes. Canada was a new nation after 1867 and needed, in a sense, to build itself a national identity and psyche. A big part of this building process was through sports. What we have come to think of today and define as Canada and hockey was purposely being constructed in the period 1850 to 1890. As such, the sport of hockey did not evolve from British pastimes, the usual suggestion, nor was it some type of accident. It was likely a planned operation. The question becomes, if so, who planned it and why? If I had to guess, I would say that Sanford Fleming might have been the key to it all, and his connection will be looked into deeply in Chapter 9. But we have to take a step back and look prior to Canada's formation as a country in 1867. Not to early newspaper reports about stick and ball games on the ice. That is what most would expect in my book now. No, actually we have to investigate some Montreal elite clubs, particularly the snowshoe and lacrosse clubs, which were part of a template which would also be used on hockey in the 1870s. and the historical political unrest of the period, which was the main fuel for the entire operation.